We are live, so allow me to begin. Good evening and welcome to this virtual forum arranged by the Equitable Education Committee of the Fourth Presbyterian Church of Chicago. My name is Shannon Johnson-Kirshner and I'm the pastor here at Fourth Church. One of the gifts of being the pastor here is that this congregation feels called to make space for hard conversations. Typically, we literally make space by having all kinds of forums and classes in our different physical spaces, but tonight we're making this space, setting the table virtually. The staff and members of Fourth Church believe it is our responsibility to bring people together in order to learn about major issues facing our city and our state. And we do so trusting that God alone is Lord of the conscience, and that people of good faith may very well differ on how they feel about things like this particular amendment we're discussing tonight. For those of us who are Presbyterians, unity does not mean uniformity. So thank you for plunging into the messiness with us this evening. In particular, I want to thank Claudia Jackson and the Reverend Janet Volk, as well as the rest of the Equitable Education Committee members for their commitment to this forum and their tireless energy in making it happen. I'm very grateful to them all. And now it is my honor to introduce you to our moderator for tonight, Mr. David Greising. David is the president and CEO of the Better Government Association, a nonpartisan watchdog group. And what I like even more than what he does is that David is also a member of Fourth Presbyterian Church, and I get to be his pastor. So David, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Shannon. And I'm very lucky to have you as my pastor. Thanks very much, and the congregation as well. Thanks to our panelists for joining us tonight, and thank you everybody for zooming in. I'll give a little bit of background on the topic of discussion tonight and then introduce our panelists. Article 9, Section 3 of the Illinois Constitution reads as follows: a tax on or measured by income shall be at a non-graduated rate. That's the so-called flat tax. It means all residents, regardless of income, pay the same rate on their personal income tax. Currently, that's 4.95%. Today, about a quarter of the 43 states with a personal income tax use a flat tax. Rates range from 2% in Tennessee to 5.25% in North Carolina. Pritzker has proposed a graduated income tax, which he calls the fair tax. It's on the November 3rd ballot, and the key language reads as follows: the General Assembly shall provide by law for the rate or rates of any tax on or measured by income imposed by the state. If that passes, then Illinois on January 1st of 2021 will impose 6 different rates. In the first year, 97% of taxpayers would pay the same or less than they do right now. The top 3% of taxpayers would see their rates rise to a top rate of 7.99%. That would be the 6th largest rate nationwide among 32 states with a graduated income tax. California's tops at 13.3%. The battle over the graduated income tax has attracted more political spending than any constitutional amendment in memory. It's being called a battle of the billionaires. Governor Pritzker personally has contributed a total of $56.5 million to the Vote Yes for Fairness Political Action Committee. And that's been countered by Ken Griffin, chairman of the investment firm Citadel, who has contributed $46.8 million of his own money to the coalition to stop the proposed tax hike. Regardless of how the November 3rd vote turns out, education will be affected, and it's the Education Committee of the Church that is hosting us in this panel tonight. Pending the outcome of the vote on the constitutional amendment, Governor Pritzker is holding $150 million in education spending in reserve. That money was due to come to the schools beginning January 1st. School budgets already were under attack. The state's new evidence-based funding formula requires the state to increase spending by $350 million each year through 2027 to get what's called fully funded. But Governor Pritzker's fiscal 2021 budget did not include that annual increase. The COVID-19 pandemic has made things even worse. To get a taste for this, consider Chicago Public Schools. CPS was expecting nearly $350 million from a federal COVID relief package this summer. That never materialized due to a budget impasse in Washington. At the same time, CPS added more than $500 million to its fiscal budget this year, due in part to a 10% system-wide increase in salary. One more note on the graduated tax amendment. Lieutenant Governor Juliana Stratton late last month said the Pritzker administration would increase income taxes by 20% if the amendment does not pass. If this happened, it would bring in an additional $4 billion in revenue, which is more than the $3.4 billion impact slated from the graduated tax itself. Even so, if that happens, it's not necessarily good news for spending across the state. Governor Pritzker has raised the possibility that spending on education, public safety, and social services would need to be cut by 15%. So that's the scenario in which we find ourselves today. And that's the topic that our three panelists will be discussing with some questions from me after opening remarks of about 3 or so minutes. So I'll introduce the panelists. Ralph Martire is Executive Director of the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. He's also the Arthur Rubloff Endowed Professor of Public Policy at Roosevelt University. CTBA is a liberal-leaning think tank that contributed to passage of the evidence-based model of education funding in fiscal year 2018, as well as the 2011 temporary tax increases under Governor Pat Quinn. Leslie, Ralph, hello to you. Thank you and welcome. Leslie Geisler Munger was appointed in 2015 as Illinois State Comptroller by Governor Bruce Rauner and also served the Rauner administration as Deputy Governor. As Comptroller during the budget impasse, Leslie made state legislators and officers stand in line for payment along with other contractors and vendors as the state's bills ran up to, I think at one point, about $14 billion of unpaid bills. Leslie also served as acting director of the Illinois Department of Commerce and Economic Opportunity. Welcome, Leslie. And Robin Steans is president of Advance Illinois, a nonprofit that works toward a public education system that leads to success in college, career, and civic life. She also is board chair of the Steans Family Foundation, where she focuses grant making in the Lawndale community. A longtime public school parent and former high school teacher, Robin has spent over 20 years working on public school reform. Welcome, Robin. Welcome to the panelists. And Ralph, could you please introduce us to the Fair Tax Amendment, as Governor Pritzker and I think you call it, and why you think there's a case for passage?
Well, we only call it that because that's what the governor calls it, so it makes it easy. Everyone knows what you're talking about, right? It's a two-part process, and the amendment itself has nothing to do with any specific rate structure, et cetera. The fair tax, when you hear that, it's the specific rate structure. So the amendment would just change the restriction in the Illinois Constitution that requires the income tax to be levied at one flat rate. And it would allow legislators to decide to levy an income tax at a graduated rate or a flat rate. It doesn't require a graduated rate structure. The legislation that passed that would immediately become implemented on January 1st, that's called the Fair Tax legislation, does in fact create a graduated rate structure that assesses some higher rates on higher levels of income and lower rates on lower levels of income. So that's the initiative itself. Now, why does it make sense? And the answer is tax policy. So if you literally took a course on fiscal and tax policy, like the one I teach at the master's level at Roosevelt University, you would know that different taxes and different fees are supposed to play different roles. It's much like when you put together a portfolio for your investments, right? You don't have all large cap, all small cap, all real estate. You have a balanced portfolio because different investments do different things. The income tax has two jobs. Job number one, every other tax and fee imposed by state or local government to support services, sales, excise, users fees, all those things are regressive. That is, they take a greater portion of the earnings of a low or moderate income family than they do of an affluent family. So one of the jobs of the income tax is to offset the natural regressivity of every other tax and fee by raising revenue in a manner that focuses on top income classes. This is the only way with a graduated rate structure you could actually have a tax that is designed to offset regressivity and raise taxes only from wealthier individuals or primarily from wealthier individuals. Because literally every other tax or fee is regressive. The second thing that the income tax is supposed to do It's supposed to respond to how incomes are actually shared in the modern economy. And so I'm going to try to get this up here, if I can find it, and share screen, my one PowerPoint slide. And that's not the slide I want. It went the wrong way. How do I make it go the other way?
Well, while Ralph is looking, I'll point out to our audience, our attendees, that you should have received a packet that has some really good in-depth slide presentations from each of our panelists. They won't have time tonight to get into their slides in any depth at all, but I recommend, if you haven't already, that you take a look at them, because there's a lot of really powerful information.
All right, well, I'm going to stop the share because I can't get it to show up the one slide that I wanted to slide. For some reason, it went forward. But I know the data. So in Illinois, and this is based on what Illinoisans filed with the federal government on their income tax returns through the IRS. From 1979 through 2017, the wealthiest 1% in the state of Illinois saw their average incomes increase from just over $411,000 to $1.4 million, an increase of 254%. The bottom 99% of income earners in Illinois saw their average incomes increase from $51,000 to $61,000. I mean, that is telling. Income inequality has grown on a substantial basis, and this is Illinois-specific data. Now, a flat rate income tax can't respond to this reality and focus in a little bit of an additional tax burden at the top where incomes are growing substantially over time. So basically, having a flat rate income tax as required by our Constitution prohibits Illinois from using the income tax for its two intended purposes. Not surprisingly, this doesn't work. And here are the two outcomes. Number one, because it doesn't offset the natural regressivity of every other tax and fee, Illinois has one of the most unfair, that is, regressive taxing systems in all of America, where everyone in the bottom 20, 40, 60, 80% pay a substantially greater portion of their income in state and local taxes than do the wealthiest 1%. In fact, the bottom 20% are paying well over 14% of their income in state and local taxes in Illinois, whereas the wealthiest 1% have seen all this growth in income over time, pay 7%. So double the burden at the bottom than it is at the top. But the second problem, so from a fairness standpoint, clearly it's not fair. But from a fiscal policy standpoint, if you're focusing your revenue collection in a regressive system solely on low and moderate income families, which ours does, or disproportionately, then what happens is your revenue system won't keep pace with the modern economy over time. And that's precisely what's happened in Illinois. So for generations, our revenue growth hasn't kept up with inflation growth. And the data here are compelling. In fiscal year 2020, after you adjusted for inflation, total revenue in the state's general fund was less than it was in the year 2000. And what's eye-opening about that, 20 years earlier, right? But what's eye-opening about that is we actually increased the income tax rates in that period. The individual rate went from 3 to 4.95% where it is now, and the corporate rate went from 4.8% to 7% where it is now. Despite those rate increases, our revenue system isn't growing with the economy. Why? One of the big reasons is our income tax doesn't respond to how income growth gets distributed in the modern economy. Hence, every single year, revenue growth is insufficient to maintain the same level of services that were provided the prior year. That's a structural deficit, and it's a structural deficit driven by revenue. I got to make it clear it's not overspending on services that has caused this, because today in Illinois, we are spending 20% less on education, health, social services, and public safety. And those four services comprise 96% of our service expenditures. We're spending 20% less on them in real terms today than we did in the year 2000 under Republican Governor George Ryan. And the reason for that is this bad tax policy that is forcing us to cut spending.
That's a great overview. Thank you very much for that. And I'm glad you touched on education and other social services at the end, because I think that will be of interest as we go on. Leslie, what does this proposal look like from your perspective?
So first of all, thank you all for having me here. As those of you who've looked at the pre-work know, I'm opposing this amendment. I'm opposing it because I think what we've heard about it is not what we're going to get. You've just heard some information from Ralph, which is all nice and very theoretical, but people do not make decisions based on theory in a vacuum. They make economic decisions in their families every day. I think everyone does, possibly, except for our governments, our state and federal governments, who don't have to rely on their own money. They can just continue to tax us. And so I'm concerned because what we've heard about this tax, what they've promised us is that the taxes are going to go up on someone else. They've promised it will fund education. They promised it will help fund pensions, that it will put Illinois back on a strong fiscal path to the future. But read the tax amendment as it is. If you do that, you'll notice there's no rates, there's no brackets, there's no protection for retirees against taxing retirement income. There's no restrictions on the number of times that taxes can be raised. There's no promise that people with low incomes won't see their taxes go up, just that someone else's taxes will go up more. There's no stipulation that the funds raised from this tax will go to education or to reduce property taxes or anything. There's no protection. There are just a lot of promises. And I think if we look at what has happened in the state over the past decade at least, it's, one thing we've learned or should have learned is that we cannot trust our politicians to keep their promises. And here's just some examples. The state constitution requires that the legislature pass a balanced budget. And yet I can tell you as a former comptroller, we have not had a balanced budget in the state for 20 years. The state requires that the Constitution requires that the state be the primary funder of public education. Yeah, where are we with that? The state offloaded the majority of education funding on property owners in the state, who now bear the burden of the second highest property taxes in the country. The lottery was supposed to fund education and help build that up. Where did that go? And you already mentioned, David, the information about the evidence-based funding, where the state promised to put in $350 million a year, and yet here the governor in his own budget didn't even put it in. Yet I will mention that they did fund $260 million of increases for AFSCME employees that were paid in July. And I heard Ralph, or I think David, maybe you mentioned the 10% increase in salaries for CPS. These aren't going to fund things that help our children directly. So while they've been doing all this, they've raised our taxes twice in the past decade, each time promising to cap spending, to pay down bills, to fund pensions, to increase school funding, and yet they have not. And today we have the 9th highest total tax burden in the state. We have the 2nd highest property taxes. We have the 6th highest state and local taxes. And in a 2019 poll conducted by NPR and U of I, 61% of Illinoisans want to leave the state. And the number one reason is taxes. Number 2 is corruption. So the 2021 budget that they just enacted has a $6 billion deficit. If you add to that the $7.5 billion of unpaid bills sitting in the state, that's $13.5 billion the state needs today. This tax, best case, according to the governor, is going to bring in $3.5 billion. Where are they going to get the other 10? They're going for the middle income families, because that is where the money is in the state. 2/3 of tax payments are made out of the middle income families. And when they do that, they'll exacerbate the exodus out of the state, reducing the high income earners, reducing retirees. It will devastate our small businesses, leading to job losses. To adequately,
if I can just cut in, because I want to get Robin on the table here too, but let me ask you one question. Is there anything specific about this proposal that concerns you as regards education funding, or just these broader concerns right now?
Well, I was just about to say, so education funding, David mentioned that we have cut spending every year. And I guess this is really kind of the key. To adequately fund education and all the critical services in the state, we need to get control of the debt burden. And 1/3 of our revenues this year, the revenue estimate of the state is $36.5 billion. 11 to 12 billion of it, 1/3 is going to fund pensions and retiree health care. That's just for the year, and it's not enough. It should be 16 billion. And we're losing ground. And so if we want to fund education, what we need to do is we need to reform retiree pension and healthcare benefits, which now consume, as I mentioned, 1/3 of spending. We need to reduce the units of government, which is putting a big strain on a lot of expenses. We need to pay down our bills and stop paying extra money to pay for the debt on that, and put in place policies that will lead to a growing economy. And my fear, if this
All right.
passes as it is, can I just finish my sentence because it's the last thing? My
Sure.
fear
Yeah,
is
go ahead.
that if we go down this road of taxing only, we will lose the leverage of getting us a real long-term solution to the problems that Illinois has financially.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And Robin, I know Advance Illinois is not in a position on the amendment per se, but you know, if you could give us an overview of kind of what's at stake here for education in Illinois.
So that is my job. I appreciate you saying that. I'm not going to get in the middle of that debate, but am going to try to lay out why does it matter that we're having this conversation, because education is unbelievably important. So let me just quickly go through. Oh dear, it's not. There we go. You should know as a start, Illinois significantly underinvests in education from birth through the career continuum. What do I mean by that? If you look on your left, this is what we should be spending on birth to 3 and 3 to 5 year olds. $14,000, $10,000, and what you'll see on the other side is how much we are spending. We spend about $2,245. The governor has a commission. It's going to be coming out with a report. You're going to see we are billions of dollars underspent if we in fact want children to do well later. This has a couple of implications. One, it's terribly unaffordable for people to get childcare or preschool or the kind of services they need birth to 5. We're only able to serve roughly 50% of Illinois' children from low-income families across the birth to 5 continuum. There are deserts across the state. It is a statewide problem. This is not a problem in one area or the other. There are pockets and deserts and underserved areas everywhere. And here's why it matters. If we look at the yellow line, we now have a kindergarten readiness assessment. So we do a dipstick on how kids are when they come into kindergarten. Just 29% of incoming kindergartners are where they ought to be socially and emotionally in terms of their math and their language development and linguistic skills. Just 29%. And you can see even worse, look at the gaps that have already started before kids even begin their K-12 career. And that underinvestment in early childhood and the results that we see in kindergarten shows up in the K-12 system. Why? We actually are a pretty good state in terms of growing students' academics from 3rd grade through 8th grade. We're about 6th in the country in 3rd to 8th grade growth. I believe this is reading. And we're actually seeing really good growth. You know, some of our, I think this one shows that our Black students are actually outperforming our white students. But if you notice anything that's in the shade, those students are not reaching proficiency. So even those students are making the gains you would expect them to get. They should be getting 5 years of growth in 5 years' time. We're basically getting that, but we're not reaching proficiency, which is why we can be the 6th best in the country at growing our students academically from 3rd to 8th grade, but be 30th in the nation in reading, 32nd in math in terms of the actual proficiency. All of that because we've underinvested in K-12, in the early child years, but we're also underinvesting in K-12. You know, we worked incredibly hard at Advance Illinois on passing the evidence-based school funding formula. We now have a way of, because we're extraordinarily reliant on property taxes, as Leslie mentioned, what that means is we've had an incredibly regressive way that we fund schools. So one of the things that we have done is we make going into passing it is we were one of the most regressive, inequitably funded states in the nation. We're spending 81 cents on the dollar for our low-income students and students we should be spending more on. We also were one of the least adequately funded. The evidence-based funding formula changed that. That was appropriate because the children who disproportionately live in those underfunded districts are low-income students, students of color. You've got the deck. You'll look at this more closely. I'm on a clock, but look at me, David. We're going. So we've got a new formula. We're driving the dollars to the districts that need it most. So every time new dollars are gone in, the deal when we passed the bill is that the legislature was going to appropriate $350 million into the K-12 formula every year for 10 years. That was going to get us, the goal was to get to 90% of districts, all districts at least 90% of adequacy. We have done that for the first 3 years. We appropriated roughly the $350 million that was required. This year we level funded. We went from having 134 districts below 60% funded to only 11 districts that had less than 60% of the dollars they need. Unfortunately, over 50% of our students are still in districts that are under 70% funded. Let me say that again. More than half of our children are thousands and thousands of dollars per kid underfunded in the districts they live in. So the gap between here, if we really want to get to 90% adequacy, is somewhere closer to $7 billion that we're underfunded in our K-12 system. I'm not going to go through this slide. Look, it would have been so lovely. I have all those little things. We've made progress. As I mentioned, you can see across the state, we're moving from red to blue just in 3 years. If we could continue on this path, the impact at the district, school, and student level, profound. And today, again, just to show that 75% of Black and Latinx students are still living in districts below 70% funded. It's under half, about 44% of white students. If we, in fact, cut our K-12 spending by 15% over the next year or two, which has been threatened, 5% possibly this year, 10%, we will lose all 3 years of gains. That the gains that we've made on funding, the $350 million for the last 3 years, will be wiped out. Higher ed, we've got some similar problems. I can't give you an exhausted look, but I can tell you we've got good news. Higher education attainment is on the rise across all groups. There are still very significant completion gaps by income, by race. But here's something to weigh in on. One of the best things we do is we've got the monetary assistance program where the state provides scholarship dollars to students in need. The number of students who apply for that every year dramatically exceeds the number of MAP grants that we're able to provide. And the amount, the percent of the cost of higher education that those MAP grants cover used to be much higher. It's really dropped precipitously. We would need $210 million additional dollars per year, and that's just in order to fully fund MAP grant at a reasonable rate. And that's just one element of higher education funding. So I got through that quickly. My point
Excellent.
being, whatever mechanism we choose, we have a seriously underinvested education system that requires attention.
Thank you, Robin, and good work. That you're right. You could deliver on that deck in such a short period of time, and thank you for that. Let me just ask you a follow-up question.
Sure.
The principals across the state right now are watching this discussion of the tax amendment and trying to figure out what in the world they should be doing with their budgets. They're waiting for this federal money that hasn't come. They don't know if it's going to come. And on top of that, there's the uncertainty of whether the evidence-based funding money in the second half of the year, beginning January 1st, will come from the state. What in the world does that look like at the school level right now?
So what was approved, as you know, was a flat funded. We were supposed to get $350 million. We didn't get it. I don't think there's a district in the state that assumes they're going to get another dollar. And more importantly, they have to make their budgets. You know, 80 to 90% of a school or a district's budget is personnel. Those decisions really need to be made at the beginning of a school year over the summer as you're heading in. So when you don't know what you're going to get, districts, particularly ones that don't have large reserves, are going to do the conservative thing, and they are not going to invest in the programming that they think their kids need. They're not going to hire that additional social worker or that teacher or the curriculum specialist. They're not going to order new devices. They're not going to order new textbooks. Those things will have to wait for another year when they know they've got the funding to pay for it. So when you play game, when you're not sure what you're going to get, the result is the districts, particularly the lowest funded districts that have the kids that need the most, are going to have to play it conservative, wait till they know they've got the money to make good on things because they don't have to reserve to dip into. And the result is we lose programming. Any uncertainty results in conservative decisions, which means programming doesn't get to kids.
Is there a disproportionate effect on the schools that are the least resourced? You showed the disparity, and that's part of the point of the evidence-based funding formula.
It really depends on the reserves, and I haven't taken a recent look to see how the reserve rates of districts compares to their funding levels, but I would be shocked if there was other than a very strong correlation. So if I don't have a lot of money sitting in a reserve somewhere, I'm going to have to play it conservatively because I go on a watch list. If I start borrowing dollars I can't pay against, I might get approved for that. It's just not good practice, and most superintendents avoid.
Thank you. I want to take a step back from the education discussion and set the political context a little bit more right now. As I mentioned in my opening, Lieutenant Governor Stratton talked about a 20% tax hike if the graduated tax amendment does not pass. I'm curious, Leslie, has that changed in your view the political dynamic as we head into the November 3rd vote?
Well, you know, it is a scare tactic. I think it's really, frankly, reprehensible of the lieutenant governor to start threatening people if they don't vote a certain way, which is really kind of what that amounts to. And I also think it's very telling that they came out with a 20% number, bringing in $4 billion when their current tax is estimated to bring in 3 or 3.5, with I think just makes my point that they need much more than what the tax that they're proposing brings in. I tell people, and especially people who are in my area where I've talked, where they're not the lowest income families, but they're not at that $250,000 and above, and they think they're going to get a tax increase. I'm serious about where they're going to get the extra money just to fund the current year. And I do believe very quickly those brackets are going to change. It will be a simple majority vote by the legislature to drop the where that higher level kicks in. And so it goes up 20% now potentially, but it's going to go up 40, 50, 80% if this passes over the next couple of years, because the state is out of money. And it really goes back to the cost of pensions. And it's interesting, Robin, when you were going through all those numbers and mentioned a $7 billion gap, if we could reform pensions and get it down to anywhere close to what it should be, which is somewhere our expense should be $3-4 billion max right now, if we had been, if we funded properly and hadn't made promises that really were never funded and kind of out of line with, what goes into the plan. Think about that money. With $12 billion, you'd have $7-8 billion to play with that could go to fund public education and other things. So,
Right. Okay.
And I just actually one other, I'll stop.
Okay. So Ralph, I'm kind of curious in terms of the timing of the announcement by the Lieutenant Governor. What does this tell us about how this is looking politically? Whether does it tell us anything about popular support for the amendment?
I don't think it tells us anything politically. I don't think it was a political statement. And Leslie, it's amazing to me that you're calling her out for scare tactics when literally the only counter argument to the fair tax is that, well, this legislation works just like they say, cuts taxes for 97% of the state, only raises taxes on the wealthiest. You just wait and see, something bad's going to happen after that. I mean, your whole argument is predicated on unsubstantiated fear tactics. I think all the Lieutenant Governor was doing, and all she was doing was saying, look, when you're in the bottom of a hole and you want to get out of it, the first thing you got to start doing is stop digging. And we got into this hole because our revenue performance at the state level was inadequate. And we have a governor that had the political will to run for governor on a tax increase, but only on the wealthy, people like him. And his reason for that was sound tax policy. That in fact, our income tax wasn't capturing adequate revenue growth over time because our income tax didn't respond to the huge growth in income inequality in our state that happened over the last 40 years. So he designed a rate structure in collaboration with the General Assembly, including Republicans, that absolutely shifted some tax burden from the bottom and the middle to the top. But guess what? After this proposal becomes law, if it does become law, the wealthiest 1% in Illinois will still have the lowest tax burdens as a percentage of income. And no, Leslie, this doesn't solve, they do. You want to look at the math? Oh, no, you don't want to look at the math. I know you don't like numbers. So here's the reality. Here's the reality of how this thing works. They raised $3.6 billion of revenue. Is that all the revenue we need to solve our problems? Let me think about it. No. But they need to re-amortize the pension debt, and your focus on the pension debt, you said that really our only cost should be about $2 to $3 billion. I think I just heard you say that, right? Not
3 to 4, 3 to 4, if we were well funded.
You know what we're paying to cover pension benefits being earned by current workers right now in our general fund? About $2.1 billion. You know what the rest of that $9 billion payment is? It's debt service. It's paying back the pensions for underfunding this very rational and low normal cost of funding benefits because we didn't bother to do it for decades. We literally borrowed against our obligation to fund a very cost-effective normal cost to hide the structural deficit because we weren't willing to raise taxes.
So
well, now they're going to raise some taxes. They're going to raise it the right way. They're going to start digging out. No, it doesn't solve all the problems. Re-amortize the pension debt, fix the sales tax, and they can.
Right.
But,
so
to say you shouldn't do one of the three things you need to do to get out of the hole makes no sense. And the other common sense thing about what Juliana Stratton said, if we don't get the graduated rate tax, guess what? It is a flat rate. So if they raise it, everybody pays. The only way to avoid taxing the middle class and low income is with a graduated rate structure.
So I'm beginning to feel a little bit like Chris Wallace at the debate the other night. So if I cut in, please, if you will, let's keep the conversation going. On the pensions, I mean, the pensions are clearly an important issue, but let's set pensions aside for tonight because we're here to discuss the graduated tax. And I think each of you have made your points as regards pensions specifically. Ralph, one question that I would like to follow up with you about is this concern that people have, and that certainly has been promulgated by the anti-tax advertising on television, et cetera, is the notion that once this passes, then the legislature is free to do as it wishes with tax rates in subsequent years. That is correct, right? I mean, there is no control.
You know, that is a fear being played up by the anti-tax groups. So let me just put it in context. So number one, there's no authority over when to increase the rates or decrease the rates or how high the rates could be created by this law that doesn't exist now, other than the right to put it in a graduated rate structure. So
Right.
all these limits in the Constitution Leslie would like to see don't exist now. There's no limit in the Constitution on retirement income. There's no limit on the number of times they could raise rates. The rate for the current income tax isn't in the Constitution, and you don't want it in the Constitution. That's number one. Number two, of the 41 states with an income tax, 32 have a graduated rate structure. That's 76%. Going back the last few decades, 80% of the time, those 32 states with a graduated rate structure didn't change the structure at all. 80% of the time. 13% of the time, they cut taxes broadly for everyone. 5% of the time, yes, they did. They increased taxes broadly on everyone. And then 2% of the time, increase taxes, but only on the wealthiest, like New Jersey's currently doing with another millionaire tax. All right, what that means is if you're a low or middle income person and you actually live in a graduated rate income tax state in Illinois for the last few decades, you have an 80% chance of not seeing your income tax increased or decreased at all, no change. But if there is a change in rate, you are more than twice as likely to see the rate be cut as you are to see it be increased based on what's actually happened. And no, the anti-tax people don't care about evidence or what's really happened in America. They just want to scare people and play on their worst fears. And that's really all they have.
This, he's now gone on 2 very long pounding me on these things without an opportunity to respond. So first of all, many of those other states that you're referencing, Ralph, do not have $225 billion of debt sitting there. If they are well funded and they don't need a lot of money, guess what? They don't need to go raise taxes all the time. And I don't agree that there is no change to the way the legislature can raise taxes, because with a flat tax, when lawmakers go to raise taxes, there is a tacit limitation, if you will, that when you have to raise taxes on your own constituents, you are going to think hard about that, because when you go home to your local area, you're going to be yelled at. People are going to be mad you raise their taxes. But when you decouple that and you allow legislators to vote to raise taxes on someone else's constituents, now it's going to be a lot easier. And there is going to be no end to the amount of tax increases we are going to see. And if it was true that there was no intention to change, to raise more taxes on these income levels, why didn't they put something in the amendment that had some limit on how many times taxes could go up, or a cap on what percentage taxes could be raised? And they didn't. And actually, I'll even reference retirement income because it's been a topic over the last couple of days in the news. And the proponents keep saying there's no intent to tax retirement income. But what Ralph didn't tell you is that of the 32 states, all of the states in the country that have a graduated tax system, all of them tax retirement at some level. And our treasurer has already alluded to it. The budget director, or the head of the Department of Revenue, David Harris, had filed bills for it when he was in the legislature. And it's only a matter of time before they do it. Why would they tax retirement income? Because no legislature wants to tax it at the 4.95% or whatever the flat tax rate is. It's too much for people on a limited income. But if they can tax it at 2%, 2.5%, that's a big savings, and then people will be willing to do it. And the reason, again, is because the state is basically bankrupt. I don't know if anyone saw
Right.
the Wall Street Journal article, but
Well-
Moody's has come out with a negative rating on the state and said that in 2021, 3 months away, 45% of the state's GDP will be taken up by liabilities. 45%.
Okay, so let's take a step back from the debate, a healthy and respectful debate, I might add, over the amendment per se and its impact, and let's just kind of set the context of the economy in which we're currently operating. Regardless of what happens on this vote, Governor Pritzker is talking about potential 5% budget cuts across the state budget this year, possibly 10% next year. Something could change if help is coming from Washington, which so far it still seems stuck. Robin, going back to the question of these educators trying to budget, what do you think the biggest vulnerability is? You mentioned a bunch of different sort of cost items, and you mentioned also the fact that we talked about some school districts might be more affected than others. What do you, when you hear about 5%, 10% budget cuts in a system that's already as challenged as it is, what is your biggest concern as regards educational achievement?
First of all, I just want to say a 50% cut, we will wipe out all of the gains that we've had in the last 3 years, which would be really devastating. And I think the vulnerability is, again, before we pass the evidence-based formula, we had, as I said, close to 200 districts that had less than 60% of the funding they needed. And again, to translate for those of you listening, like that's thousands and thousands of dollars per student less than you need. So when you do the math, what that means is that your class sizes are not what they ought to be. You don't have the social workers or counselors that you need. It means that you cannot invest in new materials, textbooks, or devices. It means that you cannot offer art programming or band. It means any manner of the kind of school that hopefully most of us grew up with or that we want for our children is simply not available. So the financial issues are profound. I mean, they're profound. We have undereducated to a degree that is it's impossible not to have an educational impact. I mean, let me put it that way. When you are 60% funded or less than, or 66% funded, you're simply not able, and by the way, since many folks here are probably from Chicago, CPS, I think when we passed the formula, it was around 63% funded. I think it's climbed to 67 or 68% funded. That's real money that has benefited real students. But it is nowhere close to what they need. Some of those also did go to teacher salaries, and some people actually criticize that, and it depends. Like there are places that have been so underfunded in terms of salaries. So you've got a community like North Chicago, for those of you who are in Lake County, surrounded by a Lake Bluff and Lake Forest, it can't begin to compete on the salary front. So it has teacher vacancies, huge teacher churn. And so one of the things it actually needed to do was start to catch up on its salary schedule because it's been underpaying teachers. Making it more difficult to attract people there, certainly to have the kind of, stable, growing, experienced task force that you need. And the single most important thing we do is the teachers we put in front of the classroom. So if you're a perennially underfunded district, you're missing all the things I mentioned, you're underpaying your teachers, you're not able to attract who you need, you're not able to keep them, and all of that pays a price in the churn and the caliber of who's in the classroom. So it's hard to calculate. It creates an entirely different educational environment for young people.
Yeah, and David, if I could just add in on the educational impact here, because I think one way, Robin and I are comfortable talking about a $7 billion shortfall. Well, $7 billion is a lot of money and it's a very big number. But I want to put that in context of the per pupil funding gap and just talk about it regionally and then by race and ethnicity. And I think this is eye-opening. So if you look around the state, the average funding gap faced by a student who's attending an underfunded school is $4,149 per student. That's the statewide average. Downstate, it's about $3,800 per kid. The collars, it's $39. Suburban Cook, not including CPS, is $3,800. The gap in CPS is $5,285 per kid, bigger than any other region in the state of Illinois. And that is substantial. And that does lead to having an inadequate education comprehensively provided at CPS, not the kind of thing you want the kids to go to. And then when you look at the gaps in funding by race and ethnicity, you see a similar eye-opening problem. So your average white student is looking at a funding gap who's attending an underfunded school, but around $3,400 per student. The average Black student over $4,600. And this racial component translates into student outcomes when you look at outcome gaps in achievement, right? If you consistently underfund education system over a long period of time, you're not going to get the outcomes you want, number one. But then if you single out low-income and minority students for a particularly poorly funded education, which Illinois' old practice did, you will see significant gaps along racial and ethnic lines in outcomes, which we do. And what's most promising about the EBF is 90% of the new money that has gone into this legislation in its first 3 years has gone to those school districts which educate over 73% of our African American kids and over 72% of our Latino kids. So the money is going the way you want it to go to address historic inequities. And this sudden stop in funding is really bad and counterproductive on levels.
So let me get into another aspect of education funding, which is the use of property taxes to fund education in the state of Illinois. And Leslie, you brought in the question with regard to the graduated tax amendment of why didn't pension reform get done at the same time? We can talk about that separately, but there also was some work being done with regard to property tax reform. And I'm wondering, would passage of the tax in your view, make it more or less likely that at some point soon we might see a serious effort at property tax reform in the state?
So I believe that passage of this tax will not impact property taxes now because, again, the money that comes in from this tax, it's already been spent. There's a $13 billion gap this year. So we can say it should go to education. Maybe a piece of it will be, but what happens next year when the cost of pensions goes up another $2 billion and we bring in $3 billion from this tax, it's going to have less and less. I would love to see property taxes reformed. There was the governor put together a panel, a task force on it. They met for quite a while. They came up with nothing. And it's interesting to hear about the funding formulas and what CPS's funding is per student. I will tell you where I live, up in Lake County. I'm sure our schools are very well funded, but they're funded because we pay for them out of our property taxes. The state gives less than 2% of our funding to our schools. We pay 98% of the cost of our schools. And a question that I would have before they raise taxes on everyone else, with the property tax base that's in Chicago, with the commercial base, with the wealth in Chicago, not necessarily in the neighborhoods that the schools need help. And I completely understand that, but we're looking citywide and able to give a 10% across the board salary hike, which is a lot compared to what normal people out in the real world get raises on. Why is there not more property taxes that can come to fund some of these things, certainly in areas of Chicago? I understand the differences with rural downstate. I've been to those areas. It's a very different situation. The property tax base just cannot come anywhere close to supporting it. But, we cannot look at this tax in a vacuum. We have to look at the total taxes that taxpayers pay. We pay income taxes out of one pocket. We pay property taxes out of our other pocket. I mentioned this in a previous thing with Ralph. I also pay a portion of my property taxes goes to fund teacher pensions at both of my schools. They are line items on my tax bill. And so we taxpayers are overtaxed, and we can keep taxing people, but people are leaving. And Ralph made the comment before about the revenues in the state being flat. He said, attributed to our tax policy, but there's no discussion about how many billions of dollars, hundreds of billion dollars we lose as we continue to send people out of state. And if you don't think we're losing population, ask yourself why we're going to lose 1 and maybe 2 congressional seats this year. So So my concern about this tax as it relates to property taxes, really the solution is to take a comprehensive look at how we fund things, to look at where we're how much money is going toward retirement promises made, again, long time ago. And by the way, Moody's said it would be a disaster to just amortize it, Ralph, because it just kicks the can down the road. So
Moody's was talking about Pritzker's proposal, which we
Moody's
opposed
said it's
because it was
bad
bad
to
and backloaded.
amortize it.
Our proposal actually hits everything Moody's put in their memo on good
Right.
reamortization.
Talking about
Moody's was absolutely not talking about our proposal.
No, but they said it was bad to amortize pensions. So I'm just saying.
No, I mean,
So
so
Elizabeth
you're
Taylor-
trying to distort the reality again because it's all you have.
Finish, Ralph. I was quiet when you
Yeah,
were.
let's stay away
So
from the
it's a
Moody's discussion.
comprehensive
Yeah.
solution to rebalance and look at where we want to spend our money. We're spending a third of revenues on people who are retired. And I have actually another question that relates to school funding, at least this year in the era of COVID, when our children are not even in schools right now. I know the teachers are teaching and there's a lot of e-learning going on, but has anyone done a comprehensive look as a business would do? You know, all businesses are doing this. You know, if we're not using our schools, have they been shut down? Are we saving money on, you know, on superintendents, you know, or cleaning, et cetera? So has there been a comprehensive look?
Let me cut in and ask Robin that question.
Can I ask?
Robin,
Yeah,
what is that?
actually about 3/4 of schools are either hybrid or fully in person. The area that you're in tends to be more remote, but the majority of schools are actually in person or in hybrid. And you can imagine that actually the transportation costs for distancing reasons, the cleaning costs, et cetera, are actually skyrocketing, as are the efforts for people to get the high-speed internet access that you need to do for the hybrid, or the fact that you have to be prepared to go remote if things change, let alone devices. So that the costs have actually been dramatically on the increase, far from the other.
Ours are all still
Is there any
remote.
chance that some of that investment can be recouped from federal, federal funding? Because the CARES Act, for example, specifically targeted outlays related to COVID.
There's been some now already. Several hundreds of millions of dollars did go out to schools directly and through the State Board of Education, and so some money has already gone out to schools to help with that. Though much of that was for this past spring. And I think the hope and the expectation has been, and of course the state budget assumes that there's going to be another package at some point with dollars either directed at schools or with sufficient dollars in a lump sum to states, that states would, because education is such a significant portion of the budget and a priority, that dollars one way or another would make their way to schools. But obviously that a second round is not materialized.
And if you want a full accounting of that, in our we just did an analysis of the FY21 budget. It's available online at CTBA's website. We have a breakdown of all the federal funding and where it went state and local for the coronavirus relief that was targeted to cover additional costs incurred by state or local governments to deal with the pandemic. So that's
Thanks for
outlined.
that, Ralph. Is that both the funds that have come in as well as those that have been talked about but not yet passed in Washington?
Not the ones that have been, only the ones that have come
Okay.
in, right? I mean, because if it's not real, it's not in our report.
Thanks for that, Ralph. And Robin, just back to you, a question. Is there any data yet on attainment as regards the remote learning versus in-class?
Oh,
learning?
Actually, there is not great information right now. Most states, including Illinois, all end-of-year tests were waived. And so we have very little information, and we also have very poor engagement information. So the window into what exactly happened, how many students just sort of went off screen and we didn't see what actually happened with learning, we don't know. There have however, been multiple studies done from different sources that project sort of something akin to summer slide. If you sort of project out, you tend to lose when you're off screen and when you're, what we can expect in terms of loss. And it again breaks along income and race, that you see very different slide, but it's as much as 6 to 10 months just from what happened in the spring. People lost an average of 40 to 45 days of schooling. Students did in remote learning just in the spring. And then you have reports from teachers, from parents, from students about what actually happened. These are national, not Illinois specific. But teachers reporting that we were teaching 2 hours of instruction rather than 6 hours of instruction. It was even less when you were in districts that were primarily low income or students of color. You had teachers self-reporting that they were not teaching new material. They were trying to sort of steady on and save on, that was not a good environment to be teaching it. So they were both teaching less and they were introducing new material at a lower rate. Again, it broke along lines of equity along income and race. So I think we don't know what we're going to be facing when we get back to normal, whenever that is. But I think it's going to be incredibly challenging. Any savings there may be, Leslie, I hope there are some in some places, but those dollars, I just think you need to think about, this is not a short-term problem, this learning recovery, this is a multi-year recovery situation that we're going to be in, that to get kids whole, not only academically, but in terms of the social and emotional isolation, anxiety, stress, et cetera, that's been going on, is going to take us years. It's going to take additional resources. It's going to be, we have to be smart about it. We're going to have to be bold about it. I mean, and that's what's hard. I'm listening to this conversation and it's not my job to weigh in on budget issues. I can just tell you that the needs are real. They're certainly not less. And in going into this, we're gonna have some very, very hard decisions to make as a state, because kids are gonna need what kids are gonna need coming out of COVID. And whether that's easy for us to fit or not, we are going to have to figure out ways to, or we're gonna lose a generation.
And
The research
Robin,
is really, really clear. We're going to
Robin's
lose
point
a
on social
generation,
emotional,
and not equally.
your point on social emotional is really well taken. In fact, before COVID-19 hit, statewide surveys in Illinois showed that a roughly 30% of the students attending public school in Illinois were fighting different aspects of depression. Well, that has gotten nowhere but worse since then. And for the schools to be able to respond to that and provide students the supports they need to be able to work through that, still focus on their studies, still achieve academically, it's going to be more expensive, not less expensive than the supportive environment that exists today. And I really actually appreciate Robin bringing that up, because it's a major issue, and it's going to be one that's going to be a huge challenge for schools, not just in Illinois, nationally.
David, one quick note, there is only,
Go ahead.
there is not a lot of analogous situations to COVID. There is one. There were sustained teacher strikes in Argentina back in the 80s where kids lost months of school during the year. They never did anything to make that up. They followed those kids into adulthood to see what happened. Their long-term educational outcome down, their employment levels down, their lifetime earnings down. So it's the closest we've got, combined with what we're seeing, the effect has been on kids now. And again, I just want to underscore for everybody listening, one way or another, the financial situation that you're hearing outlined here, we are going to have to do something about it, because that's a generation.
Right.
Thank you for that, Robin. And Leslie, you had what I think will have to be a closing remark.
I just want to say, I think high quality education for all of our students is really the civil rights issue of our day. And I understand it's very important. And I live in an area where we have great schools. And I will tell you that I see the children in my neighborhood struggling with the fully online, just, so I can imagine. And they have parents there making sure they're sitting and doing their work. So I completely understand the challenges that you're facing. I think, to close my point is I don't want anyone to think that I don't think public education and high quality is important. I do. My sons went all through public schools, as did I. My comments tonight have been in relation to how do we make sure that we have an ongoing funding stream to adequately fund education, public safety, which certainly in some of the neighborhoods you're talking about are critical to being able to be educated. All the critical things. And the state's finances are in such terrible shape right now that a Band-Aid for a short-term thing when we need a tourniquet on the wound is my concern. My concern is if this tax amendment passes, the long-term, because I'll be honest, I don't trust the legislators to not start raising those rates. So far, they haven't shown us any discipline on it every time. Then they raise the rates on higher income, will drive some of those people out. And I just like to maybe remind people that they're not just millionaires and billionaires. There are a lot of small businesses who run their business through their personal returns. So when we lose that and we drive them out, we've got to get the money somewhere. And instead of having a growing economy that will be fueling great funding for education and everything else, we'll have a shrinking economy.
So thank you for that. And Ralph, I know it's going to be very difficult for you to bite your tongue after that, but we're going to have that be the last comment. I think Ralph made a very persuasive case.
Except two quick things. There is absolutely nothing in this legislation or amendment that changes anything about retirement income taxation. That's a complete fair tactic. And I even got the wire points to agree to that in a debate with them. Number two, there's never been a peer-reviewed study that ever finds any statistically meaningful correlation between tax policy and migration. I'd like to hold up the New York Times article from Saturday. Millionaires are staying put in New Jersey despite the new tax. And there's a great book on the myth of migration type for millionaires, just put out by a Stanford University professor. It's just malarkey. So I had to throw that out there.
On that last,
great job, Chris Wallace. You're doing a great job.
No,
Hang in there.
Really know how he felt. On that last note, I want to thank this panel for a really well-informed, spirited discussion. You certainly made some really interesting comments, and especially Robin, the expertise that you bring to the education question is really, I think, helped us a lot in terms of really seeing kind of what's at stake here. The children in schools, their futures, the Argentina numbers that you mentioned are really concerning, obviously. And thanks to Fourth Pres Church for caring about issues like this. Shannon, it's great that you all were able to host what I think was an informative and constructive and even in some ways amicable discussion.
Absolutely. No, we believe that God gave us brains and expects us to use them. So I would encourage everyone who has been a part of this conversation to make sure that you do go back to your invitation for the webinar and look at the different decks that our panelists have provided, and then go and vote your conscience. We have a responsibility to be good citizens. So thank you again on behalf of Fourth Church to all of you who are on our panel and to our distinguished moderator, David Greising. And I hope all of you have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night. Good night, all. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Good night.